Greetings all, Dr. Raphael X here with my friend Dr. Salas. And before we begin, let us do a sign of the cross in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. All right, well, Dr. Salas, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And today we're going to talk about the proof of God, really Suarez proof, metaphysical proof of God. And this is really important in the time of kind of where the view of God is just experiential,
hmm
very much based on experience, and kind of reason or intellectualism is in crisis, especially applied to God. Because what's going on is that we're living in an anti-intellectual age. That's why the whole point of my YouTube channel is to kind of, incite, if you will, Catholic intellectualism. And really, God is there's no rational aspect in the belief of God. And I think this is the fundamental crisis. This is the root of the fundamental or cause of the fundamental crisis that we're living today. This kind of making religion irrational, making faith
hmm
irrational. So turning to the proofs of God, because we do believe we can prove God, we can know God exists through using reason, and the First Vatican Council defines that.
hmm
Most people know the physical proofs for God based on
hmm
Aristotle, based on Averroes, I believe.
hmm
Avicenna's more towards Suarez, and then based on Thomas Aquinas, the famous
hmm
five proofs, which are very much based on the physical proofs of God. But Dr. Salas, if you can talk to us a little bit about why why does Suarez kind of he doesn't necessarily disagree with Thomas Aquinas. Maybe he does in certain aspects, and he doesn't. He doesn't. He doesn't. He definitely doesn't have the Anselmian ontological proof of God, where
hmm
God is like immediately known in a sense.
hmm
God is proved without sense experience. But why would Suarez go down this route? Why would he not kind of just strictly follow Thomas Aquinas in the physical proofs of God?
Yeah, I think you're right to note that there's a kind of significant difference between what Suarez is doing with respect to God and what Thomas is attempting to do. And as you rightly note at the beginning in your introduction, that there's a kind of crisis with respect to how it is that we come to understand God. As you mentioned, it's just sometimes it's just this kind of emotivism, right? And I don't really have any kind of justification for my belief in God. It's just this kind of absurd leap of faith, right? And so God just becomes this kind of sentimental sort of maybe anthropomorphic crutch that I rely upon. But I would also add on the other hand too, um, you know, with respect to the progress of contemporary science, it seems that so many of your scientists want to say, well, look, God is one of these hypotheses for which I have no need, right? And so if you're going to be a true scientist, then, basically what you have is the God of the gaps that has been gradually displaced. And so we don't need to have any kind of faith in God. And so it seems as though you have two radical extremes, right? And it seems that the Catholic intellectual tradition, as you rightly point to, is this kind of median position, right? Um, and so, as you rightly point to Vatican I, right, that we can, through our own natural reason, come to some sort of knowledge of God's existence. And I think this is what's constant throughout the Catholic intellectual tradition, right? That none of these theologians, Suarez included, but also, as you mentioned, Thomas Aquinas and others, begin in a kind of vacuum, right? That is to say, look, their creedal commitments to the Catholic faith teach them that God can be known by our natural reason. And so you think often of Romans 1:20, right? The invisible things of God can be made known by the visible things that he's created. So our very faith, right, serves as a kind of epistemological warrant to pursue this kind of natural knowledge that we can have of God's existence. So I would say that that's the first thing to point out for many of these Catholic theologians, Suarez included. But then the question is, okay, how do we go about demonstrating God's existence? And Suarez's account is somewhat interesting because, as you rightly noted, he's departing from Thomas Aquinas, and I think the question here is, okay, what's the right venue for offering a kind of demonstration for God's existence? Clearly, when you turn to someone like Aristotle, this is kind of muddied a bit, right? Since you have the proof from the physics, you have the proof from the metaphysics, and so what exactly um, is the nature of this demonstration. And so when Suarez opens the 29th disputation, which is where he discusses natural reason's ability to know God, he says, well, there are a number of different approaches to this. Some think that it's just a purely physical proof, right? We can demonstrate the existence of God on the basis of a purely physical proof. Some think that it's just a metaphysical proof. Some think that it's a combination of, physics and metaphysics, each in its own proper sphere, and another that physics will eventually kind of give over to a metaphysical demonstration. And so part of this is kind of, okay, what exactly is the nature of these various sciences of physics and of metaphysics? And Suarez himself, as he explains, clearly favors the claim that God's existence is demonstrated in metaphysics, right?
Right.
And so questions pertaining to the existence of God, the attributes, the nature of God, these, as he sees it, are properly metaphysical questions. And so in that, he seems to disagree, at least in part, with what we find in Aristotle and the physics, right? And then Thomas Aquinas in part, but that's it's a bit kind of a tricky issue, right? How exactly do we interpret Thomas and what he's up to?
Right.
As Thomas himself tells us in the Prima Pars, in the very first way, he says that this is the more manifest way to go about demonstrating God's existence, and it's a proof from motion. Um, so the question, is it a purely physical proof? Is it an Aristotelian proof? Is it a non-Aristotelian proof? Does it move beyond physics and conclude in the metaphysics? And so that's an issue of great debate among, I would suggest, Thomist scholars. But for Suarez, it seems that this question of where do we offer this demonstration for God's existence goes hand in hand with, well, just what is the nature of metaphysics, right? What does metaphysics itself explore? Does it explore just created being? And it seems that Thomas, you could make the argument, suggests that it does.
Right.
Or does it explore just being insofar as it's real being, so that even God is included under the adequate object of metaphysics? And so if that's the case, then yeah, as you pointed out, Suarez seems to be operating kind of along the trajectory that someone like Avicenna established, and that Scotus picks up upon. Suarez himself seems to be following along, and it departs from just the kind of straightforward Aristotelian account, and to a certain extent, even it departs from Thomas Aquinas.
Right, right. No, that's interesting because it does. I was going to ask you, that was my next question. What is the relationship between his division of being and this metaphysical proof? But it makes sense because God, the first division of being, and uh correct me if I'm wrong, for in Thomism is substance and accident, or no, it's actually well, when, see, I don't know if they include that because I know in Suarez he does necessary being and contingent being. So that's right there. You have that, but I'm not sure if within that in Thomism and metaphysics, if they distinguish right there, and it has to do with that distinction, the real distinction between essence and existence or non-real. I don't know if that's the first distinction they make in being. I know they believe that, but I don't know if that's within and if it is, it seemed like it would be within metaphysics that, but even though it's related still that that God, so the very first distinction made again is being by participation and being in itself. So God kind of falling within the
Mhm.
metaphysical realm. So very interesting. What about that principle, which basically is almost dogmatic in a sense, philosophically speaking, that whatever's moved is moved by something else, right?
Mhm.
Which Suarez doesn't, and I think it has to do with his view on freedom because he does stress freedom in
Mhm.
a different sense than the Thomistic way. Maybe even someone would say in a more libertarian sense than, well,
Mhm.
at least the Enlightenment philosophers may say that. But what about the notion that whatever is moved by something else? Maybe Suarez did not see that as universally applicable because
Mhm.
of this notion of freedom and because of uh, because the Thomistic view of how God moves us is that we are physically predetermined.
Hmm.
right? God physically predetermines us, and in doing that, he causes our liberty. And that
Hmm.
the auxilius debate between
Hmm.
the Thomists and Jesuits. But is that does that come to play too in his rejection of the physical proof? Is the rejection of that principle as being universally applicable? Because it seems like he was okay, everything is moved by another, sure. Everything that's
Hmm.
an act or moved from potency into act is already an act, sure, except when it comes to the free act of man as free, not as act.
Hmm.
God just calls it as act, but as free
Hmm.
man is not moved by something else. Does that come to play? Do you know anything?
Well, I mean, I think for Suarez, the issue is what science are we dealing with here, right? And so, are we dealing with physics, or are we dealing with metaphysics? And to get back to your point about the Thomas and what's the first division of being, in his the preface to his commentary on the metaphysics, and then again in the fifth question of his commentary on Boetis de Trinitate, Thomas is pretty clear that the subject matter of metaphysics is ens commune, right? Just kind of common being. And so then the question for him is, okay, how does God relate to this? Does God fall under ens commune, so that God would be contained under the subject matter of metaphysics? And Thomas says, no, God falls outside of ens commune, and God only relates to metaphysics then as the conclusion of the study of what is the ultimate cause of ens commune. So, I mean, it seems as though in that way God falls into metaphysics, the demonstration, I should say, the demonstration for God's existence, at least as Thomas seems to set it up, is going to be a properly metaphysical kind of demonstration. But as you point out, when it comes to the Summa and the first way, that's where you have this claim that everything that is moved by another. And so it's the argument from motion, which obviously, insofar as it's appealing to motion, seems to suggest that the proof is going to have some kind of relationship to physics. And so now the question then is going to be, okay, is this proof strictly physical, or is it not? And as you rightly note, God moves us, and so from the Thomistic perspective, there's a kind of premotion of the will, and certainly there is freedom within the Jesuit position, especially like some of the Suarez. And I think what Suarez is going to say is this experience of freedom is something counterfactual to what we find with this claim that everything that is moved by another. Um, Suarez seems not to be convinced by the universality of that claim.
Mhm.
For instance, you can think of, the example he gives is hot water cooling, right? So there seems to be a kind of movement in the broad sense, right? Again, when Thomas is talking about motion, when Suarez is talking about motion, he's not talking about motion as we ordinarily think of today in terms of like a kind of local motion or something like
Right.
that, but kind of alteration. And so if you have a hot pot of water that's just been boiling and you set it aside over time, it is going to lose its heat and change or be moved to become cool. And it seems to do that on its own. And it's kind of interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Jacques Maritain little work on philosophy of God. And in that, he's looking at the Thomistic proofs, the five ways, but from from the perspective of contemporary science, in particular, the Newtonian mechanics, right? Which tells us that, for instance, an object in motion is going to stay in motion unless operated upon by something else. And so it seems then that you have something that's moving without any kind of cause, right? And so Newton wants to say this begins with some kind of impetus. You need that, but then once you get that impetus, you have eternal motion, or endless motion, I should say. Um, Maritain then has to kind of finesse what we find in Thomas Aquinas to try to accommodate that and say, well, it's a state of being. That's what he means by motion here, right? So you're going to continue in a state of being unless operated upon by something else. The point here is, it seems um, that you can call into question the universality of this claim that everything that is moved by another. So the pot of water cooling over time, but also you and me, right? When we act with our freedom, when we make a choice, when we move our bodies in one way or another, it seems as though there's this kind of impetus, this dynamism that wells up from within us Now, of course, the Thomists could say, well, look, what's moving you? Well, your intellect moves the will moves the intellect, and they move each other within different orders of causality, right? Efficient causality or final causality, so that ultimately it's the good that moves you when you ask your wife to marry you, right? That you perceive some kind of good there, and so that's what's motivating you. And so I think, yeah, there are a number of things that as far as just seems to find not satisfactory. And so everything that is moved by another that might have some kind of, you know, evidence to recommend itself here and there, but not as a universal principle, it seems.
Right.
And so Suarez wants to change that instead to be that everything that is made, or anything that is made by another, right? And that then definitely makes it quite clear that the argument that he's using is no longer just going to be within the domain of physics, but certainly it's going to be a much more metaphysical principle.
Right, and that safeguards their view of freedom, keeping intact freedom. That freedom does pertain to us. That we are, as humans, we are moral agents. We are deep down responsible for our acts. But giving that metaphysical twist to whatever moves is moved by another. The metaphysical twist being, as you mentioned, whatever exists is brought to existence by another, or whatever is being is brought to being by another. This actually shows God's omnipotence in the sense that even in the immoral act, that the immoral act as immoral pertains to us because we abused our freedom, but as
Mhm.
act is still caused by God, which is fascinating. That God, anything that's being has to have a first cause in the metaphysical realm. That's really fascinating. I wanted to turn to the analogy of being. Is something treated in between the two disputations of when he talks about division of beings in 28, I believe,
Mhm.
and then 29. So what is his view of the analogy, and how does the analogy of being kind of come to play with his metaphysical existence? What's that
Okay.
relation there?
So yeah, as you rightly mentioned in Disputation 28, which precedes immediately that disputation in which in which Suarez offers his demonstration for God's existence, there you have the division of being, right? And so, as
Mm.
Suarez sees it, the basic, most fundamental division of being is going to be infinite and finite being. Now, of course, as he also explains, that's just the same exact thing as necessary and contingent being, all right? And so, but for him, basically what he wants to say is the basic division is going to be infinite and finite. And so then the question then is this, is that relationship that obtains between infinite and finite being, is that going to be univocal or is it analogical? Now, already in the preceding disputations, Suarez has kind of touched upon this. In the second disputation, Suarez talks about the concept of being.
All right.
And he tells us that the concept of being is most simple. It is most unified. Okay, and so you have this absolute unified concept of being. And so then the question is, if that's the case, if you have an absolutely unified concept of being, um, must it be univocal? And so there are a number of thinkers who want to argue that basically Suarez is just a kind of crypto-Scotist. And so that there really is no difference between Suarez and Scotus on this point, and that consequently, Suarez is being somewhat disingenuous when he wants to say that, well, really, the concept of being is analogical. And they always point to this disputation 2, section 2, paragraph 36, in which Suarez says, well, if one of the two has to be denied, that is to say, the unity of the concept of being or analogy, if one of these two has to be denied, then it's preferable to deny analogy, since the unity of being has been, the concept of being has been established by much more certain arguments. And so those thinkers who want to suggest that Suarez is really subtly embracing univocity in the quotation there, but immediately after he says that, he adds, but in true reality, neither of these two, the unity of the concept of being and its analogical character, needs to be denied, because he says when you look at a univocal concept, it descends to its inferiora, right, with a kind of inequality, without any kind of priority or posteriority. So I think of the concept of animal. The concept of, or the genus of animal can be properly attributed to a cat, a dog, a human, a horse, so on and so forth, without any kind of priority. I don't say, for instance, that it has to appeal to or apply to a human first, and then subsequently to a dog or a cat or whatever. So there's a kind of there's a kind of equality there. But he says the concept of being lacks this. The concept of being lacks this kind of equal descent, indifferent descent to its inferior. And then in the 28th disputation, the third section there, where he argues for the analogical character of being, he says, okay, well, when we consider these divisions of being that we already had, named the first one, infinite being and finite being, then we see that he says this, that the concept of being, no matter how abstractly it might be conceived or considered, pertains first and foremost to God. That is to say, um, when we're talking about being for Suarez, we're not just talking about some kind of logical concept or just some kind of vicious abstraction, right? There doesn't just exist being itself. And I know that's going to sound outrageous to the Thomists, right? Who think that God is, well, ipsum esse subsistens, which is just subsistent being itself. And Suarez would agree, right? But what he's saying is, look, you don't find just being itself. You find either infinite being or finite beings. That is to say, you find either God or creatures. And so being, no matter how abstractly it's considered, pertains first and foremost to God. God, who is essentially being ase, right? Independent being. And then through God, it descends to all remaining beings, right? Per participationem, as you said, right? So you do have then this kind of, shall we say, ordered descent of the concept of being so that it pertains firstly to God and then secondarily to creatures. And since you have this order of priority and posteriority, you don't have just a strict kind of equality within being itself, but rather you have these degrees of inequality, and consequently, being can't just be univocal, as Scotus thought, but being has to be, to Suarez's mind, analogical. So, what's the basis of that? Well, how do things exist, right? And so, as Suarez said in the second disputation, real being cannot be understood without some kind of order to actual existence. And so, how do things actually exist? Well, when you look at God, God is just existence itself. God exists through himself. When you look at a creature exists ab alio, right? When you look at a substance, the substance exists in se, whereas an accident has the being of being in esse. So the various relations that different kinds of beings have to existence is going to generate an analogy of being for someone like Suarez.
Yeah, so I remember when I took metaphysics years ago, the distinction so the Thomists believe in the analogy of being also, but it's of proportionality as opposed to correct me if I'm wrong, because this is a different language to in Spanish. So the analogy of being Suarez is intrinsic attribution. So basically that being is in all because being is in its very concept, in its and this goes to the principle of individuation,
Mhm.
which is fascinating, that being is by definition individual. So
Right.
this, like, and I think the Thomas will be up in arms, but
Yeah, yeah.
the beauty of Suarez is that you talk it's a web, a very ordered web, a system that you cannot you can, it's almost like you cannot read part of Suarez without delving into the other parts, because it really is he's the most consistent. I mean, we mentioned this before. Thomas is really, I mean, the Thomists don't like this, but he does put a lot of his own in there, of course. But he's a Christianized Aristotelian, or he has Christianized Aristotle. He has assumed Aristotle, as opposed to Suarez is really independent and has, which maybe novel in a sense, but he has written his own, as opposed to getting away from the commentary method, which we talked about before. He's written his own metaphysical treatise, which is fascinating. So, I want to, do you think Suarez in general, not only in the argument for God, but does he kind of deviate from this Thomistic naturalism? And uh, is there a danger from here? So much in the argument of God as his whole philosophy, it seems like he goes more into some people will say he turns away from naturalism. Like for example, and again delving into another topic, but it's important, like the separated soul thing, where he has a view of really the soul doesn't have a it is definitely its own substance, but it exists more perfectly without the body, as opposed for Thomism having a more difficult time to justify based on it because it's based on an Aristotelian doctrine, the immortality of the soul. So generally, do you think in general, Suarez is generally, do you think in general, do you think Suarez is deviating more from the naturalism of Thomism, and that's why kind of his overall mindset is to kind of not have this physical proof because he's just more metaphysical, broadly speaking.
Yeah, this is a difficult question, right? To what extent is Suarez a Thomist, one might ask. And um, look, I mean, as we know from the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, right, in philosophical matters, Aristotle was the kind of point of reference, and in theological matters, Thomas Aquinas was the point of reference. And so certainly everyone among the Society of Jesus would regard Thomas as an authority, almost a kind of unparalleled authority. And I think when the studies have been done of the number of times that Thomas Aquinas is mentioned in the Disputationes Metaphysicae, and I think it comes in only second to someone like Aristotle, right? And so Aristotle, then Thomas Aquinas, then subsequent thinkers like Scotus and other Thomists and Scotus as well. So certainly, I think we could say that Thomas Aquinas is an authority, an undoubted, authority for someone like Suarez. And you're not just going to take Thomas and kind of throw him out the window and just say, well, we're done with that, right? Yeah, the way in which authorities were treated, not just by Suarez, but also thinkers in the Middle Ages. And you think of the way in which Thomas himself, dealt with authorities like Aristotle, but also Augustine, right? You try to when you disagree with them, you do it subtly and you try to make them save face. And so I think then that someone like Thomas, right, great novelty was precisely what he accomplished in the Summa Theologia, right? Is to okay, I'm first and foremost a Christian theologian, Thomas would say of himself. But the question I ask myself then is this: can we take Aristotle and can we take his philosophy of science in particular and construe then our sacred doctrine, our sacred teaching along the lines of an Aristotelian science, right? And so, can I in fact have a sacred theology? And that was one of following Albert the Great, one of Thomas's great contributions to the history of Western thought, Western theology in particular, was to actually construe a theology along the lines of Aristotle. Now, Thomas himself never wrote a Summa Metaphysicae, right? And so much of what Thomas is doing then is using these Aristotelian concepts to try to articulate the truths of the faith. And I remember this one passage, although I can never find it again, by Etienne Gilson, where he says that Thomas uses very Aristotelian concepts and language to express decidedly non-Aristotelian concepts, right? Um, Thomas is a Christian theologian, and so necessarily he has to adjust the Aristotelian philosophical worldview to accommodate his creedal commitments. And
Right.
so I think then that when Suarez comes on the scene, at this time we have to remember that the sentences of Peter the Lombard within various schools and faculties of theology had been replaced by the Summa Theologiae, right? And so instead of authoring a commentary on the sentences, now theologians develop their thought along the lines of the Summa Theologiae. And why not? Because it's a perfectly synthetic work, right? It's an organized scientific work. But what's lacking now is this kind of metaphysical propedeutic, as it were. And as we know, when Suarez was in the midst of commenting on the third part of the Summa, his work on Christology, he decided to stop. Right, and so when you think of Christology, I mean, obviously that's a theological issue, but it's a theological issue that's heavily saturated with metaphysical themes. And so
Mhm.
Suarez knew then that he had to suspend his theological work and basically get this work on metaphysics done. And so then the question is, in that work, is he a Thomist? I think he would say, well, yes, kind of, but probably not in the strict sense because there are many areas um, where Suarez is going to disagree with Thomas, but also many areas where he's going to disagree with Scotus as well. And so I think then that those people who would try to identify him simply as a Thomist or simply as a Scotist kind of really miss the mark in terms of what Suarez himself is doing. I think he's a kind of unique and original figure who, as a Catholic theologian, is always mindful of the tradition in which he's operating. And so he's always going to be developing his thought in conversation with Thomas Aquinas and Scotus and various other authorities within the church. And so I think one could say, sure, Suarez is a Thomist in a kind of very, very broad sense, but also aware of the fact that, look, he's his own individual and he has his own metaphysical positions that very often are contrary to what Thomas himself adopted.
Yeah, but a lot of what Suarez deals with, because he counters a lot of, or they counter him, not so much the neo-Thomists, but the subsequent Thomists, we can say, Domingo de Bañez within this golden age of Spain and outside too, that deal with questions that St. Thomas didn't explicitly deal with, or
Mm-hmm.
they try to interpret Thomas in certain passages where it seems like he contradicts himself. So I have read Suarez where he believes he has the correct interpretation of St. Thomas on these controversial questions, where we just by default say, oh, this is the Thomistic position. But Thomism, I remember reading this article, I forget the name of the theologian, but we can't always equate Thomism with Thomas,
Yeah, yeah.
which is interesting because again, a lot of these questions like the predetermination, the physical predetermination, he never explicitly talked about that. So I mean, even though you can probably extract that from his doctrine, a lot of these are like ulterior, we can say,
Yeah, yeah.
development of his doctrine. So that's interesting. How do we distinguish Suarez from Scotus, especially regarding this proof of God? Because I think uh, the concepts come here. You alluded to them. The
Mhm.
concept of the distinction of the concept. You make some formal concept and objective concept. That
Mhm.
kind of distinguishes him. That distinction distinguishes him from Scotus regarding this proof of God. Could you talk a little bit on that?
Sure. So I would say there are a number of similarities, obviously, between SCOTUS and Suarez. And the most obvious one would seem to be, the discussion of the division of being in terms of infinite and finite. You find the same division within SCOTUS. You find it even within someone like St. Bonaventure. The question, though, is okay, for someone like SCOTUS, um, infinite and finite are not just divisions of being, but they're disjunctive transcendentals, right? And so, in addition then to the convertible transcendentals, the six common convertible transcendentals, his Scotus's innovation with respect to transcendental theory was the introduction of disjunctive transcendentals as well as your pure perfections. And so, needless to say, then, if you have a finite being, which is, I think, obvious and evident to the senses, right? There are finite beings among us, then necessarily you must have an infinite being. And that's kind of how Scotus goes about demonstrating God's existence. He argues for a kind of triple primacy, right? That there is a first in the order of efficient causality, a first in the order of final causality, and then a first in the order of preeminence, right? I mean, it's this wonderfully fantastic labyrinthine sort of demonstration that Scotus offers. That you have this triple primacy, and then he has to show that they are all one and the same, that the first efficient cause is the first final cause, is the most preeminent being. So it's a fantastically uh, complex kind of demonstration that he offers. Suarez is operating along the same lines, similar lines, I should say, not same, but similar insofar as he wants to argue in terms of metaphysics, right? That okay, um, I need to show that there is, first of all, an uncreated being,
Thank
and
you.
that this uncreated being is absolutely one, and that this uncreated being is the source and author of all being, which we would call divinity, thus God and worthy of worship, right? So there's a kind of similar approach in terms of just the complex nature of the demonstrations that they argue that they offer for God's existence. But whereas Scotus understood infinite being and finite being as disjunctive transcendentals, Suarez disagrees with this, and he thinks that no, really, what it is just a division of being. And he then, Suarez, has a very different kind of transcendental view than does someone like Scotus. It's much more along the lines of what one finds with someone such as Thomas Aquinas. And so thinkers such as Jean-Francois Courtine, for instance, who are important scholars in Suarez, want to argue that basically Suarez is just a bad Scotist, right? Because they seem to operate with the same kind of terminology, but Suarez seems to abandon certain key Scotistic commitments, such as the univocity, the concept of being. The problem with this is, no, Suarez has an entirely different kind of transcendental theory.
Right.
And so are they similar? Yes, Scotus and Suarez are very similar, right? They seem both very much to be influenced by a kind of Abyssinian outlook. Their demonstrations for God's existence are robustly metaphysical, much different from what we find, perhaps, with some interpretations of Thomas's arguments for God's existence. So Suarez and Scotus are very similar, but they're very different thinkers as well.
Right, right. And if someone were to ask, why would Suarez be against, well, he probably had the same reasons as Thomas Aquinas to be against the a priori argument for the existence of God. Why would he necessarily not even be open to that?
Right. And so very much like Thomas Aquinas, although Thomas himself doesn't use the term a priori, he uses the term a kind of propter quid demonstration, right? So when Thomas is, it's the second question of the second article of the second question, the Summa, and the question there is, can God be demonstrated? And in what way? And so Thomas, if you recall, says there are two different ways of demonstration. This goes back to the posterior analytics. Of course, Thomas rephrases it in terms of his own Latin terminology. He says there's a propter quid demonstration, and then there's a quia demonstration. And a propter quid demonstration proceeds from knowledge of a cause to knowledge of effect, whereas a quia demonstration unfolds contrary-wise. And Thomas's argument, and I think Suarez would agree with this, is basically you can't have an a priori demonstration for God's existence because this would presuppose that you know the essence of God, and that something would function then as a cause of God, right? If you're talking about a kind of a propter quid demonstration or an a priori demonstration, you don't know the essence or the nature of God, and surely God would have no cause. So I think for reasons very similar, right, both Thomas Aquinas, Scotus, and Suarez, they all seem to be agreed on that no, you cannot offer an a priori demonstration for God's existence.
Now, is the reason that because I know the Thomists they kind of get on the Suarez, and we can start wrapping this up in a little bit on natural theology because natural theology is not at least mentioned in that word, maybe with similar content, what they call theodicy. Natural theology is not so much within Suarism is really it's not a science, if you will. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I know that there's a huge criticism with the Thomists because this is what it is, and you wrote an article on this actually that Suarez is actually making metaphysics. He's secularizing metaphysics, but this would seem like what we're talking about now. He's doing the opposite. What
Hmm.
you?
Right. So the the critics of Suarez will point to the fact that insofar as he develops his Disputationes Metaphysicae in a way that was never done by preceding thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas, that he is in essence unshackled, if you want to put it that way, unshackled metaphysics from any kind of theological concern. And so it is a kind of autonomous metaphysics, autonomous in the sense of it is no longer grounded by any kind of theological commitments. And so, as a result, then it seems as though being has become somewhat secularized, right? That now we have a secularized ontology. But I think this is a grotesque misreading of what Suarez is up to because, again, the context in which he develops the Disputationes Metaphysicae are Christological, right?
Right.
They're motivated by very serious theological concerns. And in the prefaces that one finds within the Disputationes and the prologues, he says that he's explicit that, look, one cannot be a polished and perfected theologian without this metaphysics. Now, it's not the case then that metaphysics is going to function as this kind of foundational principle as it did within the Cartesian project, right? As he says, no, we have to bear in mind, and he says Christian reader, right? He's addressing it to a particular kind of person, the Christian reader, who has these theological presuppositions and creedal commitments. And he says we must always philosophize with an eye to our Christian faith, right? So he's not bracketing out any creedal commitments. He's in fact quite often theological data concerns are going to direct his metaphysical thinking, right? They're going to inform his metaphysics and direct the conclusions that he reaches with metaphysics. And you see this particularly clearly in the 32nd disputation, where he's dealing with the nature of first substance, of suppositum, so on and so forth. And as he says in his arguments, there is no, for a position that he's holding, there might not be any kind of rational argument for or against it, strictly philosophical, but there are definitely theological reasons why one has to hold this, that, or the other. And
Right.
so the incarnation, right? What's involved within the incarnation, making certain that dogmatic claim is safeguarded. That's what directs his metaphysical project. So
Mhm.
the idea then that he develops a kind of secularized ontology, I think, is just a misreading of what he's up to.
Yeah, that's interesting because in my thesis I talk about really the distinction between person and nature
Hmm.
that we make it is really of theological or
Yeah.
origin. So it's like
Right. Yeah.
you would never have thought that even the person in nature, who a person is and what a person is, are distinct at all.
Right.
But really theology that has really opened up this conundrum, and therefore we have to do the theological project
Right.
to meet the
Right.
problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it never occurred to Aristotle, as Suarez says. This problem did not occur to Aristotle. Why? Because the issue of the incarnation was not present for him. And so now, given the data of Christian revelation, that forces us to think of reality in a different way, including not just the nature of God, but also the structure and nature of being itself.
And that's why he also makes the distinction with accidents when he talks about modal accidents and absolute accidents. And this is based on the transubstantiation. So the
Hmm.
transubstantiation does have where you have the absolute accidents of because they don't have a corresponding substance. They're kind of in the air,
Hmm.
the accidents of bread.
Yeah.
Modal accidents cannot they can metaphysically cannot, like God cannot make them exist without a substance because that would just be an absurdity, which God can't do because it's a nothing deep down. So it
Okay.
doesn't take away from God's omnipotence. But yeah, it's really, really fascinating. So you do see at least in Suarez a more um intimate is very manifest the intimate relationship between theology and philosophy for sure. But yeah, I just want to say poor Anselm, Saint Anselm, who's a precursor of scholasticism, but seems like even though his arguments are very, very akin to the arguments of Saint Augustine, it seems like really it's not really taken away, if you will, in scholasticism, the ontological a priori argument. So I do also want to say that the language is important, which you alluded to. That I remember I was taking metaphysics in my college and this is for the masters. And I was writing about certain Suarezian terms like metaphysical essence and physical essence. And the professor actually got upset with me. He said, no, 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 because we were using primary material, which was we were using the metaphysics of Aristotle, which some criticize it as being a little messy and not so ordered. But when
Hmm.
I was using these terms, he said, no, these are neo-scholastic terms that you cannot use. So I was like, wow, this is really so metaphysical essence, physical essence, fine. But you're right. So spot on is in the sense that the language has to when you learn about a philosopher, his language can be slightly different from
Yeah.
what another philosopher says, like Kant, for example, when he uses transcendental in a total different sense than,
Right.
the scholastics. But anyway, yeah, so definitely um I will link your article again. I did another video, your article to the on the Christology, which is fascinating. It really helped me out with my thesis, so I thank you for that. And yeah, I'll give you the last word.
I think, yeah, there's much to consider in Suarez's approach to the philosophy of God. Um, and I guess I look at it as, well, it's not so much that he's competing with other thinkers like Thomas Aquinas or Scotus or something like that. But again, what is the concern here? The concern is to, as he sees it, to manifest the truth of the Christian faith. And so, more than anything else, I think we need to bear in mind that Suarez is a Christian theologian. And as such, then, he's concerned with the truth of Christian claims, of Christian commitments, creedal commitments. And he's operating then much more, I would say, in concert than in antagonism, much more in concert with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and Duns Scotus. And so we can have a kind of robust sense of scholasticism um, as distinct from something like the early modernity that's going to come along, in a few decades after Suarez. So, yeah, I guess I would just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's I mean, just to build on what you said, which is interesting. As Thomas Aquinas, with you can say the sound naturalism Aristotle, he really pushed and motivated centuries later the scientific revolution, right? Turning to the experimental, to the senses, valuing the senses as sources of knowledge. But I think Suarez in our times is is really an illuminative philosopher, and can help out in interpreting reality within science, because science is taking this metaphysical turn, which is making scientists kind of worried. But I think Suarez could just be a light, and definitely look into Suarez. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Salas, for coming, and
Sure.
hopefully we have future videos. And thank you, and God bless everyone, and take care.
Thank you.